Well, I might not get to see my notes, but that's all right. So I've been working in north central Nebraska for 7 years with conservation programs. I spent about 5 years working directly with the Legacy Project as a private lands biologist in Northern Prairies. And I spent the last 2 years as a public lands WMA manager working in this area. And I'm going to talk today a little bit about some work I've been doing to try to put natural disturbance processes back into some management on some of our wildlife management areas. Is there a way I can minimize Zoom? There we go. Perfect. So when I say disturbance, what I'm talking about is events or processes that alter the plant community by interrupting growth, altering which plants are dominant. And these events promote heterogeneity and diversity in the plant community by doing that over time. There's a couple that we have a fair amount of control over: grazing and fire. So I'm going to focus on those. There's been quite a bit of research done looking at how these disturbance processes change the plant community. They provide different habitats for different species as they're spread across the landscape. That provides a mosaic of habitat and really benefits a host of species in both time and space. And through some of our private land work we've done up here in North Central area, we've seen a really kind of a synergenic effect from combining fire and grazing. The interaction of the two seems to have a greater effect on the plant community. For instance, grazing animals on recently burned grasslands tend to eat less forbs. They select the grasses because they're higher nutritive value. So you get a release from the flowering plants. We tend to see a lot of seed production occur. Areas that grazers select within paddock, the areas that they target is often different after a fire than it was before. So we get a rotation of areas they've selected. And all of that results in better wildlife habitat, and really like to use that combination of those two management practices. And rest is a really powerful tool. You can really improve plant vigor through rest, allow the plants to be able to put down a lot more root and bud resources. But you can have too much of a good thing. Excessive amounts of any management over time tends to favor a certain select species, and you lose diversity. And this is an area on one of my wildlife management areas that I know hasn't had really any disturbance of any kind for at least 7 years, potentially longer. And species diversity is suffering. You can see pretty substantial thatch layer building up. And cedars have been mentioned several times during the conference. We're no special case here. We have plenty of cedar problems, and these are woodlands on Keller Wildlife Management Area. And here you can see the understory is suffering quite a bit. There's not much growing in here, just because of the density of the cedar. The chance for recruiting young tree seedlings that are adapted to abundant sunlight like oaks or pine is pretty low. So kind of wrapping all of that together, I've got a desire to put more fire and grazing to work for wildlife habitat on our wildlife management areas. We're using both on these areas, but there's a lot of places we aren't. And part of the reason for that is in a lot of places we lack some infrastructural needs to put those things to work. And so here's an example for fire. When I start thinking about planning a burn, one of the first things I think about is fuel breaks. Where are we going to stop and start a fire? And then one of the next things that I'm concerned about is water sources. This example on this map, Fred Thomas Wildlife Management Area is up here near the top. And we've been working with our neighbor planning about a 1,300 acre burn area for a couple years. And just looking at this, we'd like to burn the woodland on the creek. We'd like to burn the prairie. And so right here, he's got a trail that crosses the creek. And so that was a logical place. We talked about putting in a woodland fire break there. He has a access trail that runs along the east side of this creek. So we can put in a grassland fire break here. The river makes a great fire break, the highway. So then we just need to come up with a fire break that connects this upland to the river and put one in down here. He's got a number of water sources for his cattle spread out here. But along this east side, there aren't many. And so for water sources, we talked about positioning like some 1,000-gallon water tanks along this line. So here's kind of a typical or an ideal example of some breaks. This top one is a woodland break. Typically, we're looking for like 150 feet either side of an access trail. And in that area, we're going to remove ladder fuels, those smaller cedars and other volatile fuels that would carry fire up into the canopy. When we leave species with volatile oils like pine or cedar, we're typically going to limb those up 6 feet to remove that chance of fire getting in the canopy. This is a typical grassland fire break that we use. Typically, we're hanging or mowing about a 30-foot width around the edge, and we have some sort of bare ground strip towards the inside edge of that area. Here's just an example of a fire break we installed last fall out at Keller, and this one kind of shows it because it's a bad example of how thatchy things can be. If you have the opportunity to hay, to install that instead of mow, that's preferable. You can get the material off the site that way. But installing these in the fall for a spring burn works pretty well because wind and snow and rain has a chance to move that material out of there. Here's a burn we did on private land in an oak woodland setting. This fire break's been prepared with about a 10-foot mow line where we can drive vehicles, and then on a much wider strip, we've removed ladder fuel so these mature trees we're not likely to get fire in the canopy. And so this is a pretty typical, all too common example of cedar encroachment occurring on some of our areas. We've got a woodland draw here. Cedar's moving outward from it into the prairie. It's filling in gaps in the woodland. So where on this landscape can we put a fire break so we can use fire to manage the cedar? And this draw actually became one place I could get a vehicle through potentially. And so look at a map. This map on the right shows slope, and the darker the color is, the steeper the ground. And in this canyon type terrain, where I can put a vehicle really limits kind of where we can put fire breaks. And so this east draw here became an option to connect the prairie upland to the river through a fire break. And then there's a ridge that's drivable here on the west. And so we installed a woodland fire break in those 2 locations outlined in yellow. And here's an example of that work. Here's right after it was implemented. East field break looking uphill. The next photo would be on this hillside back there looking up the draw. This is after 1 growing season. We'll burn these brush piles from the cedar, and then when we're ready to burn, we'll either put a mow line on this ridge line or down along the edge of those trees, and that'll be where we'll be able to control the fire. And you can see kind of what the density was in the background there. This is the west field break. You can see we've got kind of a trail already running through the middle there. Next photo would be about right there. This is 1 growing season. And so I'll move a little bit into some grazing infrastructure. Before we start thinking about things like fence and tanks, which are fairly permanent structures, really want to think about your land and what you have. Kind of the first thing to think about is what's the production? How many pounds of production of forage does it produce? And there's a lot of ways to kind of get at that number. And you can collect samples and figure out what your production is. It's going to vary some year to year, and you need to consider what kind of year you're having. NRCS has range management specialists that can be very helpful. Web soil survey is a really useful resource for looking at what your production potential is in different plant communities that could occur on that type of soil and on different weather conditions. But kind of the take home I wanted to say was both the number of animals and the duration of their matter. Both of those components feed into how much demand. And so you just need to balance that with what you have available. Timing also matters. Different plants are palatable at different times of year. And depending on what time you're there, diet selection will vary. For instance, if you have quite a bit of Kentucky bluegrass invading your sandhills, then targeting grazing from late April to the first week of June, when it's rapidly growing, is going to set back those plants, that Kentucky blue, a lot more than if you're there in, August. And so it's important to think about your objectives and the timing that way. And also the type of grazers you might use matter. Just kind of as an example, for cattle, water is sort of the center of their universe. They're going to concentrate use near the water. And that's particularly true of lactating cows, say, in the heat of the summer. But on the flip side, if you had dry cows there during a cooler season, they're going to concentrate less near water. Waters won't be as a concentrating effect. Whereas, if you have sheep available to you as a grazing animal, sheep, this kind of center of their universe is usually shade. And so they're going to concentrate use near shade resources. And so depending on what you're trying to achieve, it's important to think about what kind of grazers you might want. If you've got steep terrain, yearlings are a far better choice than cow-calf pairs. Okay, I'll talk a little bit about water sources and fencing. Just kind of wanted to throw out wildlife-friendly fencing as something to think about. Here's some criteria I'm looking at as I'm replacing fence or putting in new fence. There's some great publications with a lot of detail out there. Colorado and Montana here have some excellent resources if you're interested. I'm going to go through an example here with Plum Creek Valley. It's got a lot of good things going on with the grazing we're doing, but there's a couple challenges I'm wanting to address. It has a 3-pasture system set up here. It's fenced into 3 different paddocks. And right now what we're doing is grazing each paddock every year, but they start in a different pasture. And what that does is basically the time they're there in the year is different. And so they're targeting different plants because the timing is different. The other really good thing it's doing right now is that rotation is providing enough fuel in the first pasture they were in that I can do a burn or have the opportunity to do a burn every year. But there are some challenges I'm having, which we'll get into here. Cattle typically don't travel more than a mile from a water source, and this north pasture is 1.5 miles long. This far northeast corner is a little over 1.25 miles away from the nearest water. So what that means is if I stock this for all the acres in here, just because of where the water is located, I'm going to get heavy use on the west end and light use on the east, just because of where the water is. Also, there's some odd pasture arrangements. I'll talk a little bit about this east one first. It's a good thing the water source is down here, because when you have a part of a pasture that narrows, like it does at the north end there, that tends to concentrate animals. And so if the tank was also on the north end, because water with cattle concentrates their use, we would have a pretty bad situation. Luckily, it's not set up that way, but just something to think about as you're laying out fences. There is, however, a parking lot back here that's fenced out, and this creates a situation where cattle have to walk around that. And so this triangular piece up here sees pretty light use every year just because of that fence. And so the pasture arrangement is a little odd. I'm looking to actually remove this fence and add some fence here and basically convert it to a 4-pasture system. I'll get a little bit more into why I might do that. So heterogeneity is a good thing, and grazing varies across the pasture. That's a good thing. But if you have kind of some extreme use differences within a pasture, and they're the same every year after you graze, then you're favoring certain plants and you're going to lose some diversity. And so we're seeing high use along the creek, in these 2 west pastures, in the upland just east of them. This back corner on the north paddock, just because of slope, they don't use it a lot. We already mentioned this fence in that south pasture, and this other corner is just kind of far away. So by changing up the fencing here, I can make these creek pastures a little bit smaller. Which will shorten up the time cattle are in there, and help a little bit with the distribution of animals across there. And here's kind of a planning map I've been working on. So there's that zoomed in on the north pasture, take out that fence, add fence where those blue lines are, and then I've selected a few potential tank locations to go out and check. Just going to add 1 water source in one of these. When you're selecting a place to put a tank, it's important to, particularly in the sandhills, avoid kind of your steeper slopes. This is a slope map back here. These colored areas are a little bit steeper. Just because cattle will concentrate near their water, if you put those near steep ground, you're likely to have some erosion issues. Here's another example of a place I'm working on trying to get it ready to graze. I know this place hasn't been grazed in 7 years, and I don't think it's been grazed as long as it's been a wildlife management area. Twin Lakes is out in the sandhills, and kind of biggest point I want to make with this is look at multiple years when you're planning things, because especially in the sandhills, water level can change quite dramatically. This one on the left is a 1999 imagery. Water levels were just a little bit higher in 2019 than that, but that's pretty close to what they were. And then 2018 is on the right. And on this south end, there's a pretty large piece of prairie, and looking to put a cross fence here because that location stays dry in most years, and it also avoids going over this large sand dune complex where we might get some bad trailing if cattle move along the fence. The north paddock, there's a lot of low ground that gets flooded. I'm planning to rely more on temporary electric fence, and so that paddock can, the fence locations can change with the water level. And then I just wanted to think some of the funding sources, a lot of the work going on now on the public lands would be through Wildlife Sport, Fish, and Restoration Act, and then the Nebraska Environmental Trust. And we have some funding from other sources, but also a lot of expertise and input what's going on. So. I'm done.
All right.